You voted for President Biden, but now you say you feel like he's turned his back on you. Why?
President Joe Biden right now is facing a bit of a problem, and it's one that he created himself. Pushing through a contract onto rail workers that does not include any paid sick days. And of course, rail workers are fighting back. And there is actually a way that Biden can dig his way out of this, and I'll get to that in this video. So I'll go over reactions from various rail workers, including one that was on CNN, and some details around the story. So first off, this, of course, just the headline here from Axios: Biden signs rail agreement into law, thwarting the strike. So this is the idea. Just the reason why they could even do this is because of the existing Railway Labor Act. But the idea that Congress can make it illegal for these unions to go on strike is in itself insane. They shouldn't have to go to Congress to get their paid sick days. But this is the situation that they are currently in. Now, there are, interestingly, a lot of headlines and mainstream pushback against what Biden did. Now, normally you don't see this. You don't normally see the union side represented in these public discussions, but here you're actually seeing it. So a few headlines here from NPR. Some rail workers say Biden turned his back on us in deal to avert rail strike. This one from The Guardian. Biden just knifed labor unions in the back. They shouldn't forget it. And even MSNBC here, Biden picked the wrong side in the railroad union fight. And of course, over the weekend, I also covered Pete Buttigieg on CNN, where Jake Tapper was actually hammering him over not including paid sick days in the bill. So really good to see some actual mainstream pushback there, which, I mean, the reason why this is important is because this is what ultimately can lead to some actual change. If it was just, a bunch of left-wing websites online screaming about this, they're not going to care. But when it gets to CNN or MSNBC or, New York Times, Washington Post, that's when the White House actually begins to listen and maybe recognize that this is a serious liability for them going into the next election if they don't solve this problem now. So, some quick details here. So the Senate passed legislation on Thursday, but rejected a House-drawn measure that would include 7 days of paid sick leave for workers. The provision's failure is a loss for many union members and progressive lawmakers who have slammed the fact that rail workers have no guaranteed paid sick days. So it's very easy for them to include this, by the way. It's not like this is a industry that is starving for cash. They made $7 billion of profit in 90 days. So this from The Lever. While opposing a plan that would have required them to spend $321 million to give workers 7 paid sick days, the main railroad companies raked in more than $7 billion in profits and paid out over $1.8 billion in dividends in a year where they and their lobbying groups have spent more than $13 million lobbying Congress after railroad CEOs pocketed more than $200 million in compensation. They can absolutely afford to give their workers some paid sick days. And by the way, this is regardless of them being able to afford it. If you're going to have people who are working these long hours or working generally to create this kind of profit for you not to treat these people with some actual respect and understand that they have lives outside of working for your company, then you shouldn't be able to exist. You have to actually treat these people with respect, give them some paid sick. All they're asking for is 7 paid sick days. They initially were asking for 15, which they definitely deserve, but they themselves negotiated down to 7, trying to find a middle ground. And still, these massive profitable companies, CEOs, gave them the finger because they knew they could rely on Congress and Joe Biden to force a contract onto them. And that's the key point here. So just worth mentioning here, as Nina Turner points out, Democratic caucus senators voting to not break the railroad strike. So only Warren, Bernie Sanders, Hickenlooper, Gillibrand, and Merkley voted against this. So against forcing this contract onto workers. So again, keep in mind the few Democrats here in the Senate that are actually on the side of the working class. And I'll get to as well the I guess debate around progressives in the House and whether or not what they did was right. So I'll get to the explaining that. But Paul Blest here, a reporter, tweets out, it is making me insane to see Democrats do the "why don't you blame the Republicans" thing for rail workers not having paid leave. The Democratic president of the U.S. explicitly told Congress not to change the agreement. The vast majority of Republicans voted with him. So this is not a situation, and I saw this in my own comments on my initial video on the rail workers, that they were trying to blame the GOP. You can't do that here. This is purely on Biden and Democrats. Biden absolutely could have included the paid sick days, but he was too afraid of going up against the rail CEOs. So instead, he chose to force a contract onto workers who, of course, traditionally have a lot less power than people at the top of society with lots of money. Now, one last thing here. Jonah Furman, again, fantastic labor reporter. I've quoted his stuff before. He quote tweets Paul Blest here saying, and he appointed the board that crafted the agreement, talking about Biden, and it was his labor secretary that crafted the second agreement, and he could have at any point wrote a different bill to avert the strike. It is Democrats all the way down. All right, now let me get to this clip here. This is roadway mechanic Reese Murtaugh, who was on CNN discussing his disappointment with Joe Biden.
You voted for President Biden, but now you say you feel like he's turned his back on you. Why?
Well, what we've seen with this great rail strike of 22 that has ended very undramatically is we've seen unionized workers' right to bargain collectively get trampled on. Their voice has not been heard. They voted against a contract. We have a pro-labor president who loves to, pat himself on the back for that. And when the going got tough, he turned his back on the people he's supposed to be looking out for.
And when this bill that is now going to go to President Biden pass the House, it had a separate measure that actually had 7 paid sick days for you and your colleagues. That did not make it through the Senate. They voted against it. Are you asking President Biden not to sign this bill?
It's a good question. You don't go against what your members vote for. So shout out to Jamal Brown for getting that bill going and looking out for us. But the sick days was more of a distraction. The main attraction here is Joe Biden forced a contract on our unionized workers who voted against it. And listen, we don't want to strike, but the only way we can get a fair contract is to strike. That's our only leverage. The rail carriers do not negotiate in good faith. The Railway Labor Act does not have time limits on these contracts we negotiate. So that can mean we can be negotiating a contract for 5 years, and we have no power to get a good contract. Our only leverage is to strike. And I feel like this whole process, the workers have kind of been demonized, where it's like, y'all are trying to shut the economy down. We're not. We're out here working 14 hours a day in all weather conditions. Most of us work outside. We need some sick days. Why aren't you guys talking to the rail carriers? We're out here every day working, moving freight, making things happen. And when the leaders we vote in who are supposed to support us, turn their back on us, the system's broken.
All right, so I'm going to get some other reactions here from other members of the union online here. But look, this is, as you see here, his biggest issue, and this is the biggest issue, is that Biden pushed through this contract, signed it into law, this resolution, against the will of the majority of those rail workers. Now, it is true to point out that 8 of the unions, actually at leadership of the unions, signed on to it or agreed to it, but it was rejected by 4 of them, and those 4 represent 55% of the workforce. So a majority of the workers rejected this solution, this resolution, yet it was still passed through or pushed through by Congress and Joe Biden. So that's the biggest issue here. And of course, I'm sure if the sick days were in there, then you'd have a lot more on with this idea. But still, the idea that Congress can avert a rail strike when it is their right to strike as unions, to me, is that in itself is the real issue here. But some other reactions. So, quote, the actions speak for themselves. Ross Gruters, a railroad engineer from Des Moines, Iowa, who co-chairs the advocacy group Railroad Workers United, told USA Today earlier this week, quote, don't tell me what you are, show me what you are. He's not stepping up for workers in the way that he should be, Grutter said of Biden, whom others have blasted this week for effectively, quote, saying that these essential workers have to suffer to preserve the profits of the railroad industry and its billionaire owners. Kim Kelly here, also a labor reporter, tweets here, quote unquote, pro-labor until workers actually try to take action against the oligarchs who have bled them dry for decades. Instead of calling on greedy railroad bosses to accept the workers' modest demands, this administration has sold rail workers out at every turn, cowardly and shameful. This is from freight railroad conductor Gabe Christensen, who says here, quote, I have shirts for me campaigning, blue-collar Biden shirts. Christensen told the New York Times earlier this week, I knocked on doors for him for weeks and weeks. Since Biden's move against rail workers on Monday, Christensen has been besieged by texts from furious co-workers whom he had encouraged to support the president, the Times reported. The conductor said of his angry colleagues, I'm trying to calm them down. Now, look, it's fair to point out that, say Trump won again and he was still president. Would they have had 7 sick days for these rail workers? I highly doubt it. Would have any of the concessions that were made, quote unquote concessions, because again, these people are already way underpaid and underappreciated. But, the increase in pay, for example, would that have been included? It's impossible to know, but based on how the GOP have been even worse against labor than Democrats have, I have to assume based on history that this would have not been a good or an even worse deal for them if the GOP were in power. That said, we don't live in that timeline, right? Like we're living in this timeline where Democrats are in power, Biden's in power, and Biden has the ability to include these sick days or to maybe, I don't know, rework this entire thing to not force any contract onto these unions. But he didn't choose that route. Instead, he chose to side with these billionaire CEOs. And it's only fair that there's pushback against him and that hopefully he still has time, or he does still have time, but hopefully he uses this time that he has to actually do something about it. But Ryan Grimm here, reporter, tweets out there seems to be a lot of confusion here about the vote yesterday. So this is over the House vote. So there's a lot of, there was initially a lot of, I guess, hate thrown at the quote unquote squad, the more progressive members of Congress for how they voted. But apparently their vote, now you can still say this is bad strategy, and I agree with you. It's terrible strategy. But apparently this was decided with the unions in terms of their vote to support the contract. So they both supported the contract, forcing the contract on them, and the sick pay bill, which was, or the amendment, quasi-amendment. It was two separate pieces, but they voted for both. So because they voted for the initial bill without the sick pay, essentially forcing this existing contract onto them, there was a lot of pushback to that, but apparently the unions worked with them to agree to push for that so that they could get the sick pay bill into the Senate. I guess that was the idea. Clearly didn't work. You're not going to get the Senate to pass sick days, but that is what happened here apparently. So as Ryan Grimm tweets out, there seems to be a lot of confusion here about the vote yesterday. The unions wanted the Progressive Caucus and the squad to vote the way they did so they could fight in the Senate. You can disagree with that strategy, but it's the one that the unions settled on. And if you don't trust Ryan Grimm for whatever reason, he's a great reporter, but say you don't trust him. Jonah Furman has been a very solid labor reporter and very critical of Democrats as well, as I showed you earlier, and you're going to see here as well. So this is not someone who's, jumping in, parachuting in to defend the squad. He's just saying what happened. So as he writes here, what's worth calling out here is the failed union strategy and the Democratic Party sellout of the rail workers. Focusing on the squad here is criticizing the third string QB for not landing the Hail Mary. And from Mika Utrik here, I don't think progressives in Congress did everything right during rail negotiations, but it's worth noting that engineer Ross Gruters says here that the squad should be commended, not condemned. Quote, they've stuck their necks out for railroad workers. So the guy I showed you earlier complaining about Joe Biden, he's siding with the squad. Now, it's worth questioning then, why did Rashida Tlaib vote against passing it, and she was, of course, applauded for doing that, being one of the few people in the House to actually vote against forcing the contract onto workers. And that's fair to ask, because I think she took the right vote. But apparently, the squad worked here with rail workers to decide on this strategy. Ryan Grimm also tweeting out, union source tells me their next push will be to demand Biden include railway workers in the executive order that mandates 56 hours of paid sick leave. So, this is how Biden can solve this problem. If through executive order he includes these paid sick days because they were taken out of it or not included in Obama's 2015 executive order mandating at least 7 paid sick days for employees of federal contractors. So rail workers were excluded from that. Biden can change that, include rail workers in that, and voila, problem solved, and doesn't have to worry about, making an enemy of the working class, which right now, a lot of people are, I guess, sort of waking up maybe for the first time to recognizing that Biden is not exactly who he says he is, even though occasionally he says the right things, maybe even makes the right moves sometimes. But generally, historically, has not been, a big friend of labor. That said, back in, I think it's the 90s or 80s, Biden was actually arguing against forcing contracts onto rail workers. So back then he understood it was undemocratic in terms of workplace undemocratic. But now he's, of course, changed his mind. And I believe that's it. So we will see if this executive order happens or some other strategy happens. But it appears to be the focus right now is if there's enough pressure on Biden to do that, then that could solve this issue, at least in the meantime. Again, the bigger issue here is still the fact that Congress can force a contract onto rail workers when they should have the right to strike.